good to be talking with you all today. My job today is to set the scene for my colleague Sapna's presentation on the new National Standard on Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace. We often dive straight into a description of what the standard is and to some extent what the relatively immediate impulses were that led to it. But today we do have the luxury of having a few minutes before we do that to reflect on some of the broader social, scientific and legal trends that have paved the way for the standard. Because of course the standard didn't emerge from a social vacuum. Its project was possible only because some deep foundations had already been laid, and some of them go back many years. And most of these have to do with changes, you might almost say an evolution in the way we think about mental health in general and about the role of the workplace itself as a determinant of mental health in particular. So there's probably no better place to begin than with a definition of mental health that was developed in 1948 by the World Health Organization. Next slide, please, Dot. Slide 8. And this definition, again, as I say, from 1948, is a functional definition of mental health, as you can see, and it focuses on what people can do in a state of mental well-being. So we've had this concept of positive mental health floating around for over half a century, and it's gradually percolated into our consciousness as meaning that mental health is more than the absence of mental illness. And yet, next slide please, Dot, when we talk about mental health in the workplace, it seems the discussion often comes from exactly the opposite perspective. In other words, oh, you must mean mental illness in the workplace. In particular, you must mean how we treat or manage the mentally ill. And of course, indeed, we do have a problem here, as the slide, number 9, the Watson-Wyatt Worldwide Survey will indicate, because in Canada, mental illness is the leading cause of both short-term disability and long-term disability. In the US, it's not quite there yet. It's the 4th greatest cause for short-term and the 3rd for long-term. But the fact of the matter is that this is, it does represent, mental illness does represent a considerable burden for the society and for employers, as well as, of course, for the people suffering from it. So we do have a problem here. Next slide, please, Dot. So drilling down a bit further, a picture begins to emerge that serves to broaden our attention so that we look not only at the treatment and management of the mentally ill, but also at the role of the workplace itself as a producer of mental health, or, as you might say, its opposite. So if we take a closer look, we see that 500,000 people every day are away from work because of a mental health issue of some sort. And this could be for reasons of stress-related reasons, mental illness reasons, and what's increasingly coming to be known as mental injury reasons. So there's a lot of stuff built into that 500,000. And of these, we estimate that somewhere between a quarter and a third are away because of issues at work that have to do with how people relate to one another, and relationship problems that affect or are perceived to be affecting mental health. In that context, and from another source, from an Ipsos Reid survey that was done last year, late last year, 1.23 million employees in Canada say they've been harassed at work. That's 7% of the workforce. Now, albeit we don't know exactly what that really refers to, whether, how serious that is, but it clearly indicates the existence of a serious problem out there of some sort. Excuse me. So the new National Standard on Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace does try to address that aspect of the situation, and it's based upon some new understandings about mental health at work. Next slide, please, Doc. Probably the biggest single thing that has changed over the last 10 to 15 years is an an increasing acceptance of the idea that mental health, as we defined it right at the beginning, is gained and lost every day through how we relate to one another in the workplace, how we behave toward one another. Our behavior is an engine of mental health, or the lack of it. And when our basic needs at work are thwarted, then risks to mental health can arise. So the basic needs for security and physical safety, needs for belonging, needs for some sense of fairness, of basic fairness or social justice, basic self-worth, self-esteem, self-efficacy, accomplishment, autonomy. When those needs, especially when a lot of them are thwarted, then we can get into a rather hazardous situation in the workplace that is a threat to mental health. These are understandings that we have gained or been reinforced over the last 10, 15 years. Also, mental and physical health are inextricably linked through mind-body interactions. This is the domain of psychoneuroimmunology, but in fact it's become mainstream science. And another understanding related to what we've already said is that not all mental illness is brought to work. Sometimes the workplace contributes to it or even causes it, in which case we can refer to it in this context as mental injury. Next slide, please, Doc. I want to drill down a little bit into a couple of those points very briefly. The idea that everything's connected in health is not a new one, but in fact it is an idea that is embedded in the way that we're now thinking about how to protect mental health at work, because it's a portal into all sorts of other physical health conditions that are known to be associated with depressed, with impact on mental health. So when people are anxious, depressed, burned out, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a realm of other physical conditions that are known to flow from that, and they're related to one another as well. Next slide, please.
Slide 13.
Slide 13. Yes. We know that I'm not going to go into this one in any detail, obviously, because it would take too long. But the basic message here behind this concept known as socio-biological transformation is that what we see, what we perceive out there translates into emotions, and emotions, the biochemistry of emotions has an effect on all systems of the body, so that in fact we have a very powerful system going here that connects what's out there in the world to what's in here in our bodies. Next slide, 14, please, Doc. So another idea that I want to take a bit closer look at is the idea that mental injury and mental illness aren't always the same thing. What we're trying to reinforce here is the idea that mental injury is in fact a result of conduct. It's somebody did something to somebody or didn't do something they should have done that results in a foreseeable harm to somebody else's mental health. This may or may not amount to mental illness, but in fact it doesn't have to amount to mental illness in order to attract the attention of the law. Next slide, please, Doc. So when you look at that component of the total burden of mental disability that's actually borne by employers, then over 25%, perhaps even closer to 33%, is related to mental injury in the terms that we've just been talking about. And this is in fact a very new understanding, and it's still percolating, and the standard, I think, will be a vehicle for disseminating this understanding further. Next slide, please, Doc. So just to quickly review a few of the other new understandings that I think underpin this new standard is that mentally ill and injured people aren't aliens. They're us. They're like us. Often they're just good people in bad situations, and this, of course, all speaks to the trend toward trying to destigmatize mental illness, and that itself has been a major social trend. And mental health law, in recognizing that the workplace is an engine of mental health, just to follow the engine model, that an engine can be clean running or it can be dirty running, and it can produce, in the case of mental health, it can produce either social capital or social exhaust. And so what happens in the workplace doesn't stay in the workplace. It migrates out into families, communities, and society at large as net gain or loss. So the workplace is never neutral with regard to its effect on mental health, and so now we can talk about psychologically safe and unsafe working environments in the language of the new standard. This language is now being imported or upgraded to a social discourse that we can now safely have and talk about this concept as a mainstream concept. And the law increasingly sees the protection of mental health as part of the duty to provide a safe system of work. So the protection of mental health and the protection of physical health are now tending to be seen in the same context. Next slide, please, Dr. 17. So over the years, what's happened is that the law has increasingly recognized that what goes on in the workplace can attract liability for mental injury, and what is defined as mental injury has broadened considerably over the last 12 years, from gross acts of harassment and bullying that would attract legal attention 12 years ago to now even the careless or negligent imposition of excessive work demands can attract legal attention. Last slide, please. Slide 18. So we are now in a position, have arrived at a time in history when we can talk about a psychologically healthy and safe workplace as one that actively works to prevent harm to workers' psychological health, including in negligent, reckless, or intentional ways, and promotes psychological well-being. This is the language of the standard. This language wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago even. So basically we are at a new threshold. We're in a rapidly evolving social and cultural context. Now I will pass on to Sapna to tell you what the standard is in much greater detail.